See on your screen, you've got an anticipated schedule, and the items in the past are shaded in gray. The key point to consider here is May of 2024, just a couple months away, where we're going to be asking Regional Council to approve the FY25 through 29. So, next slide, please. One of the key components of this is the public engagement process, and next week we are convening 3 open house events for the public to have a preliminary review or understanding of the TIP development process, as well as an opportunity to look at the preliminary draft project list, draft project maps, and engage with member agencies and PAG RTA staff about questions they have on their topics. So thanks to our committee members for their willingness to attend. Sounds like several members have already indicated their a great opportunity to kick off the public engagement process. Following that, in April, we will have a 30-day public comment period on the final draft, full draft document. Next slide, please. Key focus of this last few weeks has been on the full draft TIP project list, which, as many of you are aware, is really the heart of the TIP, covering those 5 years as priority listing of projects and funding by phase and source. We did share a preliminary draft with the Transportation Planning Committee on February 20th and requested feedback and comments. We summarized those comments in an Excel table, and we put the PAG response next to those comments. We shared that out, an updated version of the draft project list on March 1st, along with that comment response form. At last week's TPC meeting, we discussed those comments, but there was a lot of discussion about reconciling the TIP funding and overall work program or OWP funding. ADOT recommended to remove OWP TIP IDs and use the approved work program as the sole source document for distinguishing the difference between planning activities conducted by PAG and infrastructure projects required to be included. TPC requested guidance from the management committee regarding ADOT's recommendation. Next slide, please. As many of, or all of you are aware, the overall work program is a separate effort and adopted by the Regional Council. You can see the screen captures on the left, really demonstrating that includes details on purpose, funding, projected outcomes, goals, strategies for all work elements. So it's highly detailed in terms of our planning activities. On the right, you can see screen captures for 3 of the 6 revenue and expenditure tables we have for fiscal year. Bless you. So for a total of 12 included in the overall work program. So lots of detail, including the revenues by federal, state, and local sources, all on that one page. So a lot of detail on revenues as well as expenditures. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll pause. Again, brought this to you because TPC is asking for a recommendation from the management committee on those OWP items and the draft project list. I don't know if Mr. Rokini, if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, if I may, Madam Chair. So as you recall, last year, Regional Council agreed to have additional time to be able to develop a TIP to ensure that we have the remaining RTA projects fully programmed in the new TIP. I believe we're at that point right now that all RTA projects through fiscal year 2029 are programmed and they can utilize federal and state funds to be able to complete all RTA projects. So that's the key point from the development of the TIP. As you all know, we've been having that conversation for a couple of years now to ensure that we can fund all RTA projects from the current RTA in the plan. I've had a couple of questions since then. That does not include the 4 deferred projects. The 4 deferred projects are not in the TIP because, as you recall, based on our conversations with the board, those all have to go to the voters and they are part of the RTA next discussion. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that. I've had multiple people ask that question and they are not in the TIP, with the exception of one, and that is the Pima County project that at this point is going to be fully funded using federal funds. I want to make that point because that question keeps coming up at every meeting. And so other than that, we anticipate, as Jamie said, to have the full tip adopted in May. And by doing so, I think we can at least respond to those questions about the current RTA plan. They are all going to be fully funded if the tip is approved.
And if I may, Jamie, and I don't know if this is for you or for Rod, my question looking at this and understanding what was coming out of the TPC, one of the initials that came our way, was the ADOT request. I have to tell you, I sort of are on the side of, if something is not broken right now, or it doesn't appear to be, why are we making a change? And does that cause any kind of confusion and perceived lack of transparency or anything else as it relates to taking anything to the voters as we move into RTA next? So I guess I understand this is an ADOT request to make the change. So
yeah, so actually Mark Hoffman is
Okay,
our
sorry, Rod, thank you.
is our ADOT planning representative and
no, I want to hear from Ron.
in conversations.
I will say, I'm not sure if it was a request, it's more of a comment.
Well, Mark is online as well, but he can chime in if he likes to.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sorry.
But before he does that, just make sure that you understand the process. You know, we always try to refine and ensure that every document is more accurate, more consistent, and more clear and less confusing. So the comment actually that without came through the process was, how do we reconcile these two? These are confusing. So the recommendation was to eliminate the confusion. And Mark is online. Mark, if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. So as Farhad stated, yes, it was a recommendation based on comments made regarding being able to reconcile the planning activities and the amount of funding that was included in the TIP from the approved work programming, and be able to reconcile that between the two documents. So the recommendation was that you know, the required federal action and approval of the work program is completed and could be treated as the sole source document. If there are any questions about you know, the approved planning activities and the amount of funding that has been approved for those activities, there is no requirement for the work program activities and approved funding to be also included in the regional TIP. But there also is no restriction from doing it. It is a local decision. So again, you know, the federal, there's a required federal action to approve projects, federal aid projects, and the funding, and either that is done through the approved regional TIP, and then that is entered into the State Transportation Improvement Program, or on the planning side, through the federally approved work program. So, you know, either, you know, it's got to be the federal action and approval has to be done on one or the other. But again, there is no restriction from including those planning activities also in the TIP if the region elects to do so.
That's what in practice what's happening is that as soon as the OWP is approved, the TIP information is no longer correct or relevant, and that's where the confusion comes in. By keeping the two separate documents separate, then they stand alone and they are correct as soon as they are obviously approved.
And I look to the group, as I say, I think for me, my concern about not making any modifications and changes as we come closer to RTA next, if there's any perception that we're hiding something or moving something, it is a concern. But I'll say this is not my hill on which to die. So
yeah,
Michael,
as Jamie mentioned, as Jamie mentioned, the OWP is actually a lot more detailed, and that's the benefit of that document.
Mr.
Not my hill here.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just curious. It doesn't sound like documentation is really common. It's changing. It's changing. First about this without what the TPC, what was their conversation, you know, so again, just going back to openness and making sure that why it's necessary, why it's there. I don't know that it's good or not, but I just think it. And I don't necessarily subscribe to, we've always done it that way, so let's keep doing it.
Yeah.
But let's at least have a conversation now, why it's better this way. So it's open and everybody has an opportunity to maybe you can see.
Jim, you mentioned that there was a lot of discussion at that meeting. Can you summarize that, or are there people here who can chat with us about that?
They're members of the committee. We do have the TPC chair on hand and Ms. Skinner as well. But I do want to add that, you know, my understanding was it was a recommendation. It was termed a recommendation because one of the comments we received from another member agency was the fact that the OWP and the TIP listings do not match. And so it creates confusion. And so that's what we were responding to. Had that comment not been there, we may not actually have this conversation. But the fact that there is confusion now is why that recommendation. But
Madam Chair, would you mind?
Not at all. Be happy to. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So I was the chair of the TPC over that meeting where this was discussed. And I think that the sentiment of TPC, if I could summarize, was that there was a lot of concern about such an abrupt change without any conversation at any of the committee levels regarding that policy change being done so abruptly. As far back as we researched, I think 2002 is the last tip we could find. The PAG OWP items had been listed in the tip. And so again, we just felt that as the Transportation Planning Committee to be asked to approve that draft project list without any discussion gave us some pause for concern. There was a formal action taken by the TPC to seek further direction from the management committee. And so that's why this item was brought to you today for us to give us some direction, because next week we are expected to approve the draft project list and very much like that direction prior to next week.
Okay, so, and so as I understand it, then it's not simply that you were all looking for simply a policy direction that was not appropriate at your committee level from your perspective, and something action that we can take following this conversation today.
Madam Chair, that's correct. And I should also add that we did not take any issue with the draft project list and all the other elements. It was just this one item that seemed like a major change for us to approve without further conversation.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Rod, and then Terry, I'm sure. Mr.
Chair,
Mr.
Question regarding timing. This is coming up to the TIF approval process.
Yes.
So the next TIF approval process is where the opportunity would present itself again to modify this at court case.
Of course, yeah, every time we update the TIP document.
Or would we be able to update it if we updated the TIP? In, you know, could we make this modification at another date? I'm just trying to see, we have to do it now.
Yeah.
Is there another time that might be more appropriate where to have this discussion? That's what I'm trying to mine down to. Yes.
I understand the question. Anytime we update and develop the TIP process, we can make improvements and make any modifications, and this is the opportune time to do it.
But we do a 2-year cycle for the TIP.
Currently, yes. Currently.
Now, or
So
We don't have
we
to.
could do it now, we could do it in 2 years, or we could do it as an amendment.
Depends on what the amendment is, yes, but yes, the regional council has authority to make any modifications at any time.
Mr. Roseman.
I guess maybe I'm confused on what we're being asked. So are we being asked to, is this a blending of the fund? I mean, what are we talking about here?
I'll be happy to describe the question again. So the TIP document itself is a 5-year, basically CIP plan. And Mark did a wonderful job of distinguishing the difference between the two documents. TIP is a CIP, it's for infrastructure projects. OWP is the operating budget, and it's not infrastructure, it's programming operations.
Got that.
Historically, for various reasons, some of the elements, not all of them, some of the elements that are in the operations budget were also in the TIP. And they were 80% of the time were not consistent, because every time regional council changed anything on the OWP, it was not reflected in the TIP because TIP was not updated as frequently. So the question that came through the TPC members was that how do we reconcile TIP and OWP And the response and the recommendation from Mark Hoffman, who's the ADOT representative responsible for approving our TIP, was, why are we doing this? Keep it separate, so it's clear, concise, and not confusing. And it was a recommendation.
Yeah, that recommendation makes sense. We keep them separate.
Yeah.
So is that what we're being asked?
We were being asked to confirm that keeping it separate is the right thing to do.
I would say aye.
Yeah, and then yeah.
Madam Chair, yes, I agree with Terry that, especially if we're talking about transparency, that because the whole OWP doesn't live in the TIP, then I feel that that does create the perception that maybe we're hiding something, because why don't these numbers match? And when it comes to transparency, the OWP is still approved by the original council. They review it and approve it. So it's not that, hey, we're taking it out so nobody gets to look at it. No, the original council still approves it. So I think it helps simplify things and makes it more transparent, because you don't have this, why don't these numbers match? What are you doing with the money?
What's the pleasure? I'm sorry, Paul.
I'm in total agreement with what Beth is saying as well.
So if as I understand, keeping it the way it is,
No.
keeping it,
no,
what you
no,
just said, keeping it separate. So
Yeah,
that the-
recommendation is
keeping
to
it
keep
separate.
the WP separate from the TIP, so we eliminate that confusion.
Be happy to entertain a motion.
Is it, do we need a motion or we?
We don't need a motion, it's just feedback to.
My understanding that the group was looking for some policy direction from the group.
It's really not policy, but it's at your pleasure.
Well, if we need a motion, I'll make a motion that we keep the OWP and the TIP separate.
Been moved and seconded. Any other discussion?
Thanks, Barry, for asking the question.
Thank you.
Hey, I was confused, man.
Well, Paul was supposed to tell you when he brought you in.
Yeah.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Item 5.
Madam Chair, again, this item is for information, and James does his best to give you an update on regional revenues, and this does typically include all revenues. So if you have any questions for him, we'll be able to expand on that. Go ahead, James.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mogimi, Madam Chair, members of the committee. If you turn to the revenues report in your meeting materials, I'll go ahead and begin with table 3, figure 1. For December, there was about 84.5 million in HERF and BLT collected across the region. This updated amount includes only HERF and not HERF 126426. We have not yet received figures for November and December. In our previous update for October, we've received about 59.5 million in HERF BLT. Of that 59.5 million, PAG collected about 12.4 million, or about 21% of that regional funding. The remainder was distributed directly to our jurisdictional partners. Through October, regional HERF revenues were an almost 5% increase year over year. Over the 5-year average, we stood at about 9%. Table 3 in the current report shows a 2.4% drop compared with the same period in FY23. This will see an upward adjustments once we received the November and December HERF 12.6 and 2.6 figures. Table 4 shows HERF 12.6 in detail. Through October, we collected $10.1 million, which is 15.3% more than the ADOT official forecast, and about 9.4% stronger than last year. And table 5 shows HERF 2.6 was stronger than expected collections, totaling 2.2 million through October, which is 13% stronger than last year. And with table 6 through October, PAG had just over 79.6 million in the interest-bearing account. Most of these dollars are spoken for. In table 7, we look at the city and town HERF distributions year to date. Table 8 shows the HERF 12.6 and 2.6 we've already seen. Additionally, we have Pima County HERF and Pima County vehicle license tax, the portion set aside for transportation use only. And table 9 has the previous 5 years and lets you see how much HERF the city or town received. Table 10 shows us gallons of gas sold in Pima County through various fiscal years. We normally like to see about 13%, and through October, we're just under 13% the current fiscal year. In table 11, about $70.2 million is been collected in TPT through January, trending for an almost 4% gain over the adopted budget. That also mimics the percent rise over last year's actuals, just over 40%. I'm sure that concludes my update. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tao. Are there any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item 6.
Madam Chair, Jamie's gonna give you a quick, maybe Adam is. I was gonna give you a quick update on the tip amendment that's proposed.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good morning. Additional formula funding was announced at the beginning of 2023 for FTA 5307, 5339, and 5337 grants, which may be applied to fiscal year 24 transit projects using the same priorities and guidelines that were used for developing the FY 25 through 29 TIP draft project list. Jurisdictions submitted requests for a call for amendments issued in early January 2024, and a programming exercise was conducted during the subsequent transit working group meeting. Changes to STBG flexible funding amounts were adjusted in the same manner. This formal amendment consists of programming changes for 13 TIP IDs pertaining to regional transit service in FY 24. Both the transit working group and the TPC recommended this amendment for approval by unanimous vote. Today, we're here to answer any questions for the committee and ask for a recommendation for approval for this.
Thank you, Mr. Ledford. Thank you. Are there questions from the committee? Mr. Lane? Oh, are you just been in there? Sorry. Anyone else? Thank you very much. Then the question before us is we're being asked to recommend approval of the amendment to the PAG 22-26 Transportation Improvement Program, which makes these funding adjustments to the transit projects.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Roseman. Is there a second?
Second.
Ortega, thank you. Any further discussion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. And seeing no other business to come before the PAG Management Committee this morning, this meeting is adjourned. I do.
All right, thank you, man. Thank you, appreciate it. Right on time.
The fact that Paul was late, we would have gotten done.
That's true.
That's good.
You got a few minutes.
Yeah.
at 9:03-ish, 9:02, excuse me. So, first, item on the agenda, second, is approval of the October 11th PMC meeting summary. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the summary? I would entertain a motion for approval. Motion on the floor and a second. Discussion, Jerry? Discussion? Hearing none, call for the question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Next item is the RTA next plan development. Mr. Movini, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Reed,
Yeah, Mr.
Whoever,
Chair.
all, everybody can.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. Again, as the chair mentioned, we're gonna tag team this, provide as much information as you desire, and hopefully have a robust conversation. The agenda is as detailed as we can get it, but there's a caveat in that the board met in January, and I'll give you a quick update on that. During the January meeting, the board reviewed 3 options, 2 that were provided by the CAC and 1 by the TMC. The outcome of that discussion, with a lot of relevant questions, was to eliminate one of the CAC options, which was the 5.1 option. That option was eliminated, and the only 2 remaining options now are 1 from the CAC and 1 from the TMC. Following that meeting, the RTA board had a special meeting, and we had very specific discussion about several different items that were discussed at the previous meeting. And as a result of that discussion, RTA board wanted to make sure that they get additional feedback from the TMC on the items that you have on the agenda. More specifically, we've talked about economic and inflationary contingencies. They want to get feedback on that, as well as feedback on the reserve that we need to set aside for bonding. So those were 2 specific questions that the board would like to get feedback from you. In addition to that, there was a robust conversation at both meetings about both proposals, the TMC proposal and the CAC proposal. I believe the board's going to continue to have those policy discussions. They do have several other issues that they hope to discuss at the next meeting in April, but we would really appreciate your feedback on the 2 items that we can take back to them. So with that, I'd like to have Rick give you a quick, Rick and Dave Zinda. Dave, if you don't mind joining us up here. Dave Zinda and Rick and Jeanette, I've all been looking at all these issues, and we do want to present at least on those 2 topics, on the contingency and the bonding capacity. And then after that, hopefully open it up for discussion.
May I just ask a question? Give me a quick, because watching the meeting, to me, I think my recollection, and I thought there were 3, what I think of as additional revenue buckets that were discussed.
Oh, yeah, I'd be happy to. So that's
And
part of this
certainly
discussion as well. Thank you for that. So as part of that discussion, obviously, some of the decisions were delayed until we have an update on the revenue projections. And the update on the revenue projections is going to be provided by the end of March. That's being done by Eller. We'll have that information. But regardless of what that number is, the conversation really was framed as we can respond to these questions in terms of percentages, regardless of what that number is. 5% this, 10% that. So I hope that doesn't prevent you from providing any input. Percentages can answer that question.
Thank you. But I think I go back to when we were really looking at tweaking what I think of as the hybrid plan, when we struggled with some of the decrease in expenditures, potentially, we looked at 3 opportunities. This is my recollection of potential revenue, looking at contingency, looking at debt, and the 3rd bucket was the use of other funds.
Oh, yes,
Yeah. And
yes.
so how does that?
Use of mostly PAG funds.
Okay,
That conversation took place as
Got it,
well.
thank
And
you.
I believe, and we'll let the regional council respond at the next meeting, but I believe
there was a significant concern about using PAG funds. That was discussed at detail. All right, if you don't mind, Rick and Dave are gonna tag team, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your question. That's fine.
Yes, thank you.
You got it. Okay. So as to kick off that conversation, we wanted to put together a few slides here of additional information, things that have been talked about, and just kind of some reminders of key aspects of it to help foster that dialogue that's going to go on and help point out any key aspects that need to be considered. First and foremost, kind of wanted to reaffirm that we're towards the tail end. We need to get a draft plan. We're still working to get that to the board and get that finalized. And so we've anticipated that there would be really no real changes to the project, the content of the categorical. So we're kind of operating under that premise. As Farhad mentioned, the additional forecasts that are going to be coming in then would provide a hopeful increase to the funding capabilities of it, but that would go to these particular items that we're talking about and would essentially not have to come from cuts to the other parts of the program or major changes to that area. So we recognize that's a balancing act, but those were kind of the first and foremost that we wanted to lead off with. So what we looked at to start with for the bonding capacity is several months ago, we had reached out to the jurisdictions and the partner members on this for the project proponents to say, when do you think these projects should take place? Give us your idea of phasing, delivery, and implementation. And no surprise, everybody wants to be first. So there was a front loading of this effort and this activity, and to help showcase what that discussion looks like with regards to how that fits in with the funding, we put these two graphs together. So we're going to hit first the CAC option and then go to the TMC. The left side of the diagram there shows the cash flow based on the $77 million allocation for debt service. And you can see and this is based on our then plugging in of the dollars based on the phasing that was desired by the jurisdiction. So you'd all gotten back to me with that. And then we plugged in appropriate dollars, recognizing a ramp up, construction, and then a ramp back down. So we tried to be very specific. We tried to be very inclusive of that, but at the same time being general enough that it's not locked in. But what this shows on the $77 million scenario associated with the CAC option is that years basically 10 through 17, we go into a negative cash balance. That's the left side where you see the gray bar below the zero threshold. In order to avoid that, the $100 million scenario that carries the cash flow, the cash flow associated with the $100 million bonding capability then shows everything is up above the zero threshold, so that there's not an impact to the delivery schedule that's been proposed by the respective members. So we can show that $100 million in debt service capability, that tool, if you will, to be used if needed, if that type of delivery time frame is matched. This is the allocation that's necessary for that. Going to the TMC scenario. These are the list of projects along with categorical items. We assume that there would be a constant outflow in addition to then the regular projects associated with the operational activities. This one shows even more drastic that basically the back half under the $37 million scenario, or the second part of the program from years 10 through 20, are all in the negative cash flow balance. So it would take a $100 million scenario under that particular plan approach to keep us back into the positive side. So once again, a $100 million debt service tool would be necessary to keep us in there. The other techniques would be, we simply have to stretch out the program delivery. So projects that were slated for possibly periods 2, 3 would have to push back into 3 and 4 and be stretched out further over the program. We'd have to run that kind of comparison analysis on that. And so Mike, we can come back on these as you wish for the discussion. Yes. So looking at the, then shifting over to the economic inflationary contingency aspect on that. As Farhad mentioned, LA College is going to be providing updates on that by the end of the month. But the key things that the LA College doesn't do in here is it really doesn't factor in the individual specific shortcomings, revenue hiccups, or worldwide, nationwide, or region-wide type of impacts that we can be experienced on that. They are a taxable sales, economic data that's available at the time, and then use a probability-based scenario to determine if it's going to be a pessimistic baseline or optimistic in there. So you're really looking at current economic trends and their associated expectations on that.
Based on actual collections over the last 17 years, we feel the pessimistic growth rate is the rest scenario overall for RTA next. And that graph at the bottom was shared at the most recent RTA special board meeting, in which we show how we're actually performing compared to the original projections using, I think, the baseline scenario, correct? That was adopted as part of RTA 1. So basically recognizing and saying we're already in a shortfall scenario, reaffirming the benefit of going with the pessimistic projection setup. Continuing with the contingency discussion is, given all this scenario, given all these assumptions, given the most likely outcome that we're going to have, recommendation is 5% of the total plan element, approximately $100 million would be available then. And it's for use for the whole plan. It's not just the roadway element project. And that's a key part, is that it's available if we're underperforming in a categorical, such as transit or safety, and we can utilize that through board action to make those appropriate investments. So it gives that particular safety net in there. Allocation is mitigation for any potential risks coming up, the unforeseen. We've given another tool into our toolbox, basically saying we don't have to go back to other sources. We don't have to go sweep other funds. We essentially have this now capability to deal with any unforeseen or unexpected situations that arise. This is kind of a lesson learned. There's been a lot of folks that over the last several years, as we've gone through keeping RTA current moving forward, a lot of comments. Boy, I wish we would have thought of. So we've been making note, tracking that and watching that. This is a chance to apply that and recognize that this needs to be considered this time around. Didn't do it last time. And so we're seeing what the fallback and what the alternate options are. This is a way of addressing it right up front. As a reminder, we've been saying this all along, we've been sharing this in the various committee levels, is that the economic and inflationary contingency is not the same as the cost contingency. Cost contingency was only done for the named roadway project specifically. It is unknown cost items that are added into the quantified and calculated items associated with those projects. This handles the funding side of things. We've got revenue projections. We've got those anticipated. We're going to run model scenarios, but there's a degree of unknown. So much like what we do for cost calculations, we're adding an element to cover unknowns for the funding side of the equation, so that we've applied safety nets to both sides so that we're adequately prepared should the situation arise. Contingencies for all the project costs, you've all been through that. Your staff has been deeply involved with all that. We've explained how the methodology, and I can go into that more detail if it's desired. But once again, reaffirming that the cost contingency was only applied to those roadway projects, not the categorical items, but the inflationary contingency aspect can apply to the whole plan. So therefore, we've got safety net that helps us out in those areas all the way across the board. A couple summary points, the $100 million debt service. So kind of now recapping all this, that by having that in the RTA current plan, that enabled us to be able to get what's referred to as a AA+ bond rating on that, which ensures that we're going to get favorable interest rates on that. So it's really maximizing. This is the same as your credit rating, I guess, is the way I think about it. Our credit rating is outstanding and we're able to secure that. So we're not having to make negotiations or specialized deals that are associated with the debt service that would come into play. The inflationary contingency also ensures that the fiscal environment is going to be more stable going forward. Once again, we've got that safety net for board allocation to those areas that are maybe underperforming or to offset those financial situations that we may be encountering. So it's a way of dealing with, and as we look back over the past programs that we've administered, that's kind of been one of those things, is there's always been something to pop up. We can't predict it. We can't always ensure what it's going to be, but we know there's been something, so this gives a way of dealing with that. 2006 plan, as I mentioned, did not have the economic contingency, and so as a result of the recession, you've heard Jim DeGrood present on this, even beforehand over the last couple of years, that there were multiple factors that affected that flatter than expected curve and lower than anticipated revenue collection. So as a result, we had to rely on the region's funding to come in and provide that complement. And it essentially meant that we've got to pull all those funds out of the regional source to then complement and make up the shortfall incurred by the RTA. So hopefully by applying these tools, techniques, and methods in there, we can mitigate that, if not all out, avoid that. And that's why we think the $100 million allocation, as I said, 5% of the overall plan elements is a reasonable and realistic amount to be able to include in there that would then reduce the amount available for projects, but would provide that backup. And with that, Mike, we're turning back to you. We can support any discussion questions or provide anything else that you may have.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great presentation.
Yeah, with regard to the contingency and, us use of the pessimistic forecast. I'd like to see some type of a policy statement in here as well, is if we get revenues that are above the pessimistic. So we're going to end up with extra money that's not programmed. I'd like to see some type of a policy that a portion of that, maybe 50% of that, is set aside for in case of an economic turn down later on. And the other half of it goes directly into paying down the debt service, so that we can continually assure ourselves that we're not going back to the PAG fund.
Any comments? Rob, Dr. Winter.
I have a question. Rick, can you go back to the graphs that you started off with the revenues and the expenditures? I saw something that, yeah, either of those are fine.
Okay.
I seem to notice a large spike in revenues in 06, 09. I would expect to see something more common or flatter. What are those spikes in 06 and
I'm sorry,
09?
which graph are you looking at?
Either
The
one,
right.
you could see a spike in either one of those graphs. Blue is revenue. And if you look at year 6 and year 9, there's a big spike.
Sure. So that's, again, we're doing we're doing the cash flow analysis, and then the slides demonstrate where the bonding comes in. You add that bond into your revenue, and then you pay it off over the life of the bond.
This is the point of clarification, is the left graph there assumes bonding capacity somehow using 77 million as a budget for debt service.
Correct.
And then the right one is 100 million. So the difference really is a larger issuance in 9. It looks like the 6 issuance is about the same, and then the issuance in 9 is greater. Is that?
That's correct, yeah.
Well, I think that's the.
So if you look at the graph on the left, that's when your cash balance starts going negative in year 10. That's why the graph on the 9, you have the larger debt to balance that out.
Yeah, and you see that same spike in all of the graphs. And that's what I want.
Some have bonding included, but at different amounts.
So there's no scenario up here that's page you go, Rick?
No, both the,
Some bond.
yeah, both the CAC and TMC included a allocation for, yes. And to your point, or to we held constant the delivery across all these scenarios. So the delivery timeframe is equal across every option.
I'll let you go first, because I might be a bit.
Oh, you're gonna be a bit?
Yeah.
I'm gonna be a minute.
So I'm back to what Paul said, and I think I want to go back a moment and say, well, I think as we were developing that TMC hybrid, I look at, because I'm still, is it 4.2 and the hybrid, kind of the ones that we were.
Yes. Up to you. I like to call it PNC and TMC with no confusion.
Okay. However, when we got to it, part of, I think, when we were, kicking around those ideas was looking, we had 2 options, right? When it didn't balance, we could try to decrease expenditures or increase revenues. And we got to that point where we were unable to decrease expenditures anymore. So we began to look at how we increase the revenues, which is where I think we then looked at the 3 buckets, at the contingency, at the debt, and the utilization of other funds. What I look at today is I think we're all anticipating that new information will be coming from Eller that will increase the dollars. And so I think, Paul, this is pinging off what you'd said. I'm looking at, is it possible to sort of snap that line on the programs that have been developed in a model? Are projects and programs that we continue to support? The question is in the buckets of funding, and I know there's been real concern about how we have those additional dollars. Could we then say that, again, programmatically it stays in place? Any additional dollars that we see coming in above the current estimates from the new Eller study would go to contingency debt service minimally, and then we can talk about that 3rd bucket. But I mean, and I was looking at this and thinking, what would happen if we said use the current project list, additional dollars coming that we anticipate based on the new study, up to 250 million to be allocated to contingency and debt service. And then if anything comes above that, then we go back and look at some of the project list. So maybe if I'm trying to get to, is that sort of like the policy? Effective, but go back from whence we came.
So tying into actually what Jan just said and what Paul just said, I want to sort of jump ahead a little bit to C because then it ties into A and B.
You want to jump into what?
To C, where we're talking about the different alternatives. Because I actually have with me a handout. That's why I said that I'd let Jan go first because it might be a minute. That actually kind of talks about what both of them were saying. And talks about that, that this is a for us a snapshot in time and what happens if our projections are wrong. So one of these is the spreadsheet that we're all probably kind of sick of seeing at this point. Which has the 4.2, the 5.1, the TMC modified. And then what I put in there is in blue as what I'm calling the new modified. So I want to kind of start this by saying that I've also handed out a narrative so that once you leave here, if you don't remember everything we talked about, go back to that and hopefully that clarifies everything. So I want to say that, having attended these meetings for what seems like years now, that, I've really been listening to what all the jurisdictions, particularly the city has been saying. And also having read the recent February 9th sales tax revenue projections memo that the city put out. And we have had conversations in the TMC along those lines about scaling the RTA next, because we are looking at that one snapshot in time with a pessimistic projection, that $2.34 billion. And we've never really had a discussion about, well, what do we do if there is additional funding? So, so what I've done is I actually used 4.2 as the starting point. And if you look at the new modified plan, anything that's kind of highlighted in blue, there's some additional comments on that. That I took some elements from the TMC modified plan and things where like the Sonoran corridor that nobody had any heartburn that we reduced that by $2 million. That the county agreed to remove their portion of Shannon Road, but the county agreed to the change in Valencia Road. It removes the South Tucson roadway project because South Tucson agreed to that in exchange for 35 million in safety and active transportation. If you follow down, there's another color, it's kind of like a salmon color. And these are things that I'm recommending kind of for that scalable aspect of this. Mike, just to explain for, that one of these is your project, the Irvington project. This is kind of a placeholder. I didn't want to presume like the priorities for the city. So there's a lot of modernization projects and we've had the conversation before if some of those modernization projects maybe make more sense as a named categorical or as a categorical. So this is kind of a placeholder saying, hey, we would look to the city to tell us which projects they want to prioritize as the named roadway projects. But we're looking at somewhere between 53 million and $60 million that would have to move to a categorical as part of that scale. So I'm basically saying, so there's three different kind of definitions here. That there's the RTA board approved budget, and I'm saying that that's the $2.34 billion that the board has so far approved. But then for the city's memo, what the projections maybe should be. So I'm calling that the revised pessimistic budget. And then you also refer to the optimistic. So I'm calling that the revised optimistic. So scaling the RTA, assuming that, that these are reasonable projections, that this is something we can, at least start the conversation about. So what I'm saying is then taking all of the city's named categoricals and putting them into that scaled, the revised scaled pessimistic. So there's about $258 million worth of projects in that bucket. So if you pull them, we'll call it, kind of to the side, as I've done on this chart, you now have about a $245 million bucket in the safety and active transportation sub-element that's essentially unnamed. You have a $258 million bucket of potentially named projects that goes with the scalable aspect of this. It keeps the $50 million environmental element. It keeps the $610 million transit element. It restores the debt service to 110, which is the 77 million for the debt service. And I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to that as it regards to A and B on our list today. Economic contingency is still 0, but again, I want to put a pin in that. So if you get down to like that red box at the bottom, everything that's in, I'll call it that, again, that RTA kind of baseline project. So we have about $2.3 billion of projects in that initial, and then there's a difference of 318 million that have been set aside for the scalable aspect. So we're talking about a $318 million difference. So, but there's that difference initially of about $8 million. So now we're talking about $310 million of difference between those two projects. If you look at the TMC modified plan, at one point the city had said across the board on their projects they would reduce $20 million of scope. I've taken them at their word and said that that's still on the table. So now we have a $290 million difference. Well, according to the revised pessimistic projections, if we use that, there's $290 million on the table. That if that's really what the revised pessimistic projection is, that I'm saying that anything above that 2.34 billion goes to the city. That the city would use those to do that, the other, basically that safety and transportation sub-element category. So at that point, include everything that's included for the city would be 1.31 billion. Paul, did you have a question?
I do. So in your adding up of the totals, does that take the $75 million out of?
Correct.
So the $75 million in PAG that's suggested to be taken out of PAG right now, does that remove it out?
PAG.
With back to PAG?
Yes,
Okay.
that's not included in here. So
So
that's
RTA Next will stand on its own.
stand on its own.
Okay.
So then I'm saying, if we take the scaling to the next level and talk about that optimistic projection, that's another $290 million on the table. And I'm saying that additional money would also go to the city, that if that's what those actual projections were. And that would bring the city's total to 1.6 billion, which is really close to the 1.65 that you talked about in the February 9th memo. And that gets us to about 58% of the total RTA would potentially go to the city. Now, to that point, like benefits is 75 million is back in play for everybody. The city can have all of their named sub-element projects. My recommendation would be that those projects, they could be named somewhere, but that maybe they would live in the RTA administrative code, because that would give the city the flexibility, like with First Avenue, with Broadway, that they're suggested projects, but if they're in the code, they can change the scope. Or potentially realizing, whenever they go to build them, maybe this isn't quite the project. So you'd still maintain that flexibility by not having them as actual listed named projects. I would also make the recommendation that, we're not going to know until we're into RTA Next what those projections look like. And the city still has 2 deferred projects and a number of other projects that have to be completed. At a few of the meetings, I think it was Mr. Credio had said that we anticipate, and that's where we got the 75 million, that we're going to still be sweeping funds for 5 years while the city finishes current projects. So at the end of that 5 years, we'll be done with the sweeps and we will have new projections. So we can say, hey, we're tracking over, and then all that monthly overage would be available to the city to use at that point. That if they could start on those new projects, because we would have that projection, we would have the actual evidence that we are collecting at a higher rate. So that's kind of the simplified version of this. And going back to my 2 pins is, again, I've left this at 77 million, and we haven't really talked about that economic contingency. That there was a memo that Farhad put out not too long ago that talks about how the board, at their discretion, as long as something's named in the plan, that the board can add funds to that. That if we are tracking high, as long as we talk about debt service, we have it funded at 77 million. If we reach a point where we need more funding for debt service, that the board can move funding. That even if we were to only fund economic contingency at $1, as long as it shows up in the plan, the board can, at their discretion, fund that if we find that, hey, something happened, we need to move some funding, maybe we delay some projects, move some funding. So as long as it lives in the RTA next, the board can fund it as necessary. We don't have to sit here today and try to use a crystal ball to figure out exactly how much economic contingency we'd need or exactly how much bonding, as long as we have, to the point of that slide that Rick shared, that we have enough money to get the project started, and then we can see where we fall out over the next 5 years of that RTA next, and what those projections are really looking like.
Questions, comments?
One comment, I think, I like where Beth is going here. And I think, one solution that might have bit us on the original RTA was the 4 quarters and pigeonholing projects into the 4 quarters. If we realize now that, we're still trying to project within a window what the economics are going to be going into the future, it would behoove us to create the list, but maybe not create the timing as part of what the voter plan is. It gives more flexibility in dealing with those economic downturns, because if we have a project that's slated to be in the 1st quarter and we find that, there's a dip in the revenue, we'll have that opportunity to maybe move it out to balance that cash flow and to still stay within, the amount of money that we put in for the model for the debt service. So I mean, just to keep that flexibility moving to the future.
Any comments?
Beth, I see on the last page, you have transit assigned to the city of Tucson at 610. Are you assuming that in this plan, the entire transit element would be given to the city of Tucson?
Essentially, yes.
So leaving out the circulators, the neighborhood circulators and express routes?
I think it's a little, and then this is a little bit more high level. I mean, I think it's a little more complicated than that, because there are federal dollars that are also contributed to transit that aren't taken into account. So trying to kind of parse out what that exact number is that goes to the city without taking into account those federal dollars, that 610 is probably a semi-reasonable assumption, at least as a starting point. That's between the federal dollars and everything else that'll come to the city for transit.
But you're keeping the 610 number that we've been carrying all along.
Correct.
Okay.
The town of Royal Valley would have a little issue with that.
I think we talked about that before, so that we can get into that. So thank you, Beth. I appreciate this. I had not seen it. What I would suggest is that we chat. Let's break the conversation down into 2 parts. Back to Jan's thought. Let's talk about contingency. And we'll break that into 2 pieces: economic contingency, inflation, and then pocket contingency. Now let's talk about debt service. I think there's some assumptions there. We just need to make sure we're all clear on that. Paul's point. I think Paul brings up an excellent point in terms of the what we tell the voter in the plan in terms of the schedule and what we do for planning purposes and financing. And then the third thing will be the HERF dollars and the dollar, the 75 million and so forth. So that's just my suggestion. You okay with that? Maybe just pick those off and then we'll come back and then talk about these. So we'll start off with contingency.
Mr. Chair, just real quick. So just so I'm clear, I don't know that we really delved much into, well, what was just presented, and still trying to.
I didn't do that last part.
We didn't delve much into what was just presented.
Yeah, I was gonna come back to that, because I think the pieces that will be important to that is contingency in the amount, debt service in the amount, and then HERF in the amount. And then we can talk through that, because that'll inform some of the pieces that. If you want to just go to this first, that's fine, but what I was trying to do is break it down into those pieces that RTA board asked for feedback on, and then we can come back and comment on this. That would.
No, I think that's.
Yep, Mike and Tom online.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hey, Tom, I apologize. Rick did tell me about half an hour ago that your hand was up, so thank you for your patience. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just hoping that Beth had passed on the new spreadsheet to staff ahead of time so that it could be shown on the for those of us who are online. But that appears not to be the case since it didn't come up. So just asking if that could be sent out after the meeting so that those of us not in the room could also see it.
Hey, Tom, that's a great idea. Can we get the staff to email it to them now?
Of course, any members can receive it by email, but yeah, if the topic comes up again, we have it, we can pull it up.
Why don't we do this, if you're okay with it? Why don't we email it to the participants who are online now, so they can have and look at it? Let's go through those three conversations, and then when we go back to talk about this, we can put it up on the screen so that everybody can have access to it. How's that? All right, cool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you, Tom. So let's go ahead and talk about contingency. We'll start off with that piece. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, guys, Mr. Chairman, I guess I've got a question for Rick. Now that we have some kind of a schedule for these projects, did we then go back into those individual projects and say, since this was delayed 5 years, this is how much inflation we assume in that estimate? Or if it's delayed 10 years, this is how much inflation is included?
Inflation's not been folded in. We're using just the pure cost that we've got to this date. So this is all still looking at dollars and estimates from last time. So we didn't plug in what those inflationary, everything's still in nominal time.
And those costs do have their own contingency, right?
That is correct.
Yeah, which is in the order of.
So in anticipation of that question, as a general rule, if I'm my only spot check, try to pick the simpler one. So for some of the simpler jobs, the cumulative contingency amount. So if I say contingency on section 2, section 3, section 4, environmental, whatever, cumulatively on the simpler jobs was usually about the 50% range. Dollar value, though, was usually in the 5% to 10% range. On the more complicated, it could be as high as 75 to 80 to 90% total amount, and then approximately in the 15% price tag range. So what we really tried to do was say where we have unknowns or inaccurate information or the possibility of wild dynamics, we have a higher contingency for that item. And then on top of that, we tried to break out everything that traditionally is a placeholder in either miscellaneous or contingency. So we separated out planning, design, engineering, railroad factors, everything else. So we gave a home to it. So that's why those numbers are that way they are. Does that answer your question? I was going to say, we learned that from last time. We did not apply a blanket percentage and treat it as a one size fits all. We didn't do that across the board. That was part of the complexity of it.
John, is your question about the contingency for the projects?
But it's more inflation, I guess I'm calling it.
Yeah, and then a separate conversation around I'll look here, would suggest inflation and economic downturn fall in the same category. Yeah, similar, right? We gotta prepare. Right. The piece that makes me nervous about this discussion is, have we updated the costs for the projects and all the some elements of category? Have we updated those now? You know, are we talking about current dollars for those?
They're still graded as of last summer when we did the last round with the jurisdictions on that. So those are the price tags we're using. Some of the assumptions would still carry over, but the dollar values represent the summertime of last year.
I think that makes me nervous. And as we're starting to have this, I mean, we're really starting to get down, nervous about the cost estimates are a little dated. I suspect that before this is goes too much further, probably in the summer, we should update those just to make sure that we didn't miss something that gives us all a chance. And I'm not talking about the entities. I really think our consultants who we hire to do that should really be the ones to be thinking about that. Probably not today, but in the not too distant future.
We did build that in, so there's two things to that I want to let the group know. We did build in the capability through factors, so we can do that. We expected that was always going to be a built-in aspect. Two, there's been a couple projects that have already been actively started by the jurisdictions and have reached a point, a level of design where they've got estimates of their own, and we balance very well against that. So our comparative numbers have been holding up, which is it's a reaffirmation that I think we got a lot of the key things, but your point's well taken, and we had built that capability in.
If I may rephrase that, on the revenue side, both on the revenue side as well as on the expenditure side, we can make adjustments to make sure we're comparing apples and apples based on a constant dollar amount for a given time period. So we don't have to keep going back to the revenue updates or cost updates. We'll just make the adjustments.
One of the pieces that, and I'll just, without going into the detail of the spreadsheet, I like the fact that I think we have decided to differentiate between the contingency, which is the carryover or the overlap, and then the economic contingency. And I think there's value there to really separate things out. Given that we are in it, that all of our projections today on the revenue side are on the pessimistic side. Given that, what's the group's thinking on what an economic inflationary contingency should be going forward? Not necessarily in terms of dollars, but in percentage. What are we hedging our bets on now? What is that number that we would be comfortable making a recommendation to say we should put a little pot of money, a little pot of money aside for that potential? Anybody, any thoughts on that? We'll follow.
What I was thinking, now that we kind of have, I might sound like I'm talking on both sides of my mouth now. I said take away the scheduling, as far as the voters, but we do have a model here, and we have to draw a line in the sand at some point. What if we put 3% compounded yearly against inflation for the cost of the projects, and then that's projected out in the model so that we know what the outer year projects are truly going to cost? Because that's kind of been put together by each jurisdiction as to when we think we're going to be ready for those projects. Now, granted, there's a lot on the upfront, but there's still ones in the out years that are going to have a significant increase just pure inflation alone. We draw a line in the sand, we just do that. I was just suggesting 3% is just compounded annually out to when that project is actually going to hit, to give us I guess, more honed in economic picture.
So are you thinking 3% on the project, as far as a project by project?
Yes.
Compounding as opposed to a pot within the overall budget?
Yes. Yes.
But
Just want to make sure along those lines. So if you're going to do that to the expenditure side, then you need to do that on the revenue side.
I agree.
well, except on the revenue side, I thought that the projections made that assumption. So don't the projections from the U of A include growth over time? I mean,
They do, but they're all deflated back into a constant time period to compare constant present value versus revenue totals.
Revenue present
Yeah,
value.
that's the only way to do it. You either play both sides or bring it back to a constant present value.
I understand what you just said. I'm not sure that that's what the projections are. I think that's something we can ask for clarification from U of A in terms of that future, because otherwise you would see a flat curve drop back. And what you see is an increasing curve, a line. So
Well, they do project the revenue with the growth percentage, and then they deflate it back into present value. So that's the number, that 2.34 is a constant present value.
okay, all right, I understand. Right. And then Jim,
You answered my question, which was just, we should probably make sure that we're looking at the future, or, because they're gonna be updating all of this stuff in a month. Too, so.
But I think, I was gonna say, I think we've all found that inflation has outpaced tax revenue by a small delta.
Well, and I think what I knew, I guess what I was hearing Paul to say was that that was in lieu of a line of contingency. So I would say if we look at, which is why I didn't say, think we need to also identify the revenues going up. It's just the expenditure side.
Yeah.
Because we're just budgeting that one expenditure line.
I understand,
So,
yes, yeah, that's a good point.
it's interesting. Just out of curiosity, it's more than I am in terms of numbers. At 3% compounded for the projects, what would that equate to in terms of a dollar amount in today's dollars? A lot.
Yeah.
My gut is that's gonna be a big number, right?
Yeah.
That's gonna be more than what we talked
Or
about.
even if you just.
That's what I wanted to
project
talk about.
list,
And by the way,
Not to exceed.
I'll even suggest we're really looking a little bit of belt suspended, a little bit. Because we've got a pessimistic forecast, which is 20 to 25% probability of coming true. And we're gonna build in a contingency. I'm fine with both, but I think we just need to recognize and not over project on those, in terms of even saying, well, we've gotta have belt full suspended. Just throw that out because I think it's important. And again, I'm not suggesting contingency not important. I'm not suggesting that we change the pessimistic to something else. But we just should at least be cognizant of that. I think the way to do that, and Jen alluded to that a little bit, is by preparing ourselves for an eventuality of not needing a contingency to the level we thought, and or needing more contingency than we thought. And the lesson learned, I think back to Rick's point, is we weren't ready for that. We didn't think through those in the level or the magnitude that we actually ended up having to do within the last 15 years. So having the conversation now to run those scenarios out, I think could be of value in terms of the story that we tell the voter, saying this is what we did in terms of contingency and here's why. And oh, by the way, it does not become a slush fund. It actually is used for these purposes. And if it isn't needed for that, then here's how we use. And oh, by the way, if we need more contingency, here's our plan for addressing. I think that is the development of the confidence of the story to the voter in the long term. That's my thought, at least in the way of pushing. So we have a thought of 3% compounded per project. That'll come up to a big number. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. But maybe that's realistic. If in fact we do see inflation over time at 3%, and the revenues don't. And I'm not opposed to having a conversation about revenue growth as well. But I do think that's going to be a pretty big number. Maybe back to your point, Jan, maybe we cap it. Maybe we say up to some amount, and we're off to the races. All right, folks.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes. That's why
Yeah.
raising your hand, Tom, because I can't see it online. So there you
My
go.
bad.
Thank you.
Just to remind people of some of your Economics 101, the rule of 72 says that at 3%, it would be 24 years to double. So 20-year plan would come close to doubling that amount that you were applying the 3% annually to.
That's so, thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. I think most of us must have not been listening during the comment. In fact, you were there for us.
I was gonna ask Dave to do the calculation for us. Thank you, Tom.
I almost had it.
So let's think through it, right? We know we have a contingency in the projects for project or unforeseen conditions in the projects. We'll confirm those both in the cost estimate as well as that contingency going forward. What is a reasonable contingency based on a $2.3 billion budget, at least for now, $2.3 billion budget, that we would suggest, hey, we ought to put that in the closet and leave that alone, not touch it unless we need it down the road. Any thoughts on that?
I'll go back to the 3%. I know it sounds like a lot. We're paying $220 a cubic yard for concrete right now. That was $100 a cubic yard not that long ago.
The current estimate's at 5, right? Is that what?
What's that?
Was it 5% that was getting us to the 100?
It's about, yeah, it's about-
So it's about $5 million again. So if you look at the materials in the packet, we put it in terms of percentages for that reason, and it is 5%. And again, it depends on how you look at it. I think what we're saying is that let's take the revenue estimate, whatever it may be, and deduct it by 5%. And at this point, it's 100 million. And that's really in those terms.
Thoughts on $100. And just keep in mind, 100 million as a target or gap or the amount up to that amount. Thoughts on that? Too much, too little? Again, remember, we're at a pessimistic level. I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just suggesting to think about that.
So I feel comfortable with the number. And I do like what Beth said earlier, you know, the fact that we have it in the budget allows for the board to be able to move money if necessary. So if it needs to be less, if it needs to be more, those decisions can be made at the appropriate time. So, you know, having a starting point, I think is good. Whether that's 100 million or $1, you know, I think having a starting point is good. I would be comfortable with that.
So I would tend to agree. My thought is, and maybe we don't do it today, we really should talk about, we over projected it or we under projected it. What are some thoughts around what that looks like? So that there's clarity and use the overused word transparency and what those dollars, so that it's not just a willy-nilly move. There's a methodical way of addressing any overshoot or undershoot.
I really like that, Mike. I think it makes a lot of sense to have some sort of a plan to be able to show people, convey to people. If we have way more than what we need, and this is what we'll do with it. If it's under what we need, this is how we're going to get where we need to get.
So, Bob,
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just want to clarify that. There was some dialogue that if we had excess money over the 2.34, that it was distributed equitably across all the elements. Now we're changing that now. Is that something now that we're thinking about digressing?
I don't know that, I think there was discussion about that, and I'm just going back in my memory banks, discussion about that. I don't know that there was formal direction on that. If I'm wrong, just correct me. I don't remember that, Bob, as far as specific.
Mr. Chairman, what I recall is that the CAC had that as policy consideration.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if it's ever been acted on.
Thank you. Tom's on. Tom, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, that's correct. That was one of our policy recommendations.
So I hear 100 million as least target at this point, the placeholder, which is a fixed number. And then we can talk through what that looks like. And that's in anticipation of additional revenue based on the projection. Anybody disagree with, I don't know that we need to take a formal vote, just looking for consensus. Anybody disagree with that?
Mike, I want to ask real quick, you said 100 million as an absolute, whereas Paul had described it as 5% of the amount. You're saying you're hearing the discussion at 100 million level?
I'm suggesting, what I'm hearing is 100 million is the amount.
Got it. Thank you for that
At
clarification.
least at this point. And then like Terry suggested, if that's short, we have a conversation down the road. If it's over. So we have the numbers.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that inclusive of all contingency needs, including overlap? Or above and beyond the overlap contingency?
Great question. What's your intent?
I think it's above and beyond.
Okay. Above and beyond. Thank you, Sam. Good job.
Mr. Chairman, I think what we're really approaching with this discussion is, I have no disagreement with having set asides or allocations for both inflation and for debt service. But whether we actually show those as big numbers that we are taking off the top of the revenue, or just simply report revenue that is reduced by that amount. I think that's an important topic for us to think about as it goes to the public.
Presentation.
You know, because now you're looking at maybe $200 million set aside for something that you're gonna have to explain that to the public. Unless we just simply say our revenue assumptions already take in inflation, already take in debt service. So relax, that's number one.
So excellent point. Thank you, John. I would suggest this, though. We can get to the same place, right? The key will be the story that we attach to those. So if we reduce revenue by that amount, whatever those amounts are, and we have placeholders in the plan, because my understanding is we have to have placeholders in the plan for those in order for the board to allocate dollars in. If we reduce those placeholders and take it off of revenue, it will be important, in my opinion, to educate folks on if revenues are exceeding these targets, here's what we're going to do with it. And then it's similar to the conversation we started with, which is here's what we're projecting for contingency and or debt service. We'll talk about that in a minute. And if we overshot that, then here's what we're going to do. If we undershot it, then here's what we're going to do. So either one could work as long as the story, I think, is out there and consistent and you know, obviously accurate. Oh, another hand. Oh, hey, Bill. Go ahead, Bill.
Hi. I agree, and we're getting into the part that I think is really critical. My only concern is that when we talk about contingencies, my worry is that the voters' eyes are going to glaze over, and maybe it's worse than glaze over. Maybe it's conspiracy theory. Maybe it's like, oh yeah, they have all this contingency money in there, but what's going to happen to it? And to me, it almost seems like we need to define the projects that we know can be built so that we don't get into the same situation that we're at right now, which is we said all of these projects were going to get built, but now some of them are going to carry it over, and then have the contingency projects set aside so that we say this batch of projects absolutely will get done. We've got contingency money that we would spend on these projects if in fact we don't need it all on something else. But I think we need to tell people what the contingency dollars, what happens to the contingency dollars if they're not needed as a contingency. That's it.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. Your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of related to some of the other questions is clarity on how those contingency dollars will be used. So for example, you know, first project out of the gate in RTA Next is scheduled for 45 million and it comes in at 60 million. Does that mean that 15 million comes out of contingency day one? And how are those, you know, dollars going to be doled out? I think some clarity for the jurisdictions is going to be important as we go down this road.
So I would suggest there's two parts to that, I think, Sam. One is clarity for the voter first and foremost, right? So that there's absolute confidence. We've got our ducks in a row. We know what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. We play out as many scenarios as we can without being so complex that, going back to Bill's point, voters' eyes glaze over, right? But the second then is the policy conversations about how that works. So it's the implementation, administration of that, and so that we've got clarity amongst ourselves so that we can ultimately deliver the program. So I think those are the key points. So I don't hear anyone pushing back on 100 million as a placeholder, we call it, you know, in the economic / inflation contingency. I would also suggest that we start to think hard about when we're going to update the costs, the project costs, and all of the stuff that's in the plan to include a review of contingency per project. I think that's important that we start at least thinking about that. Maybe this summer, we should be doing that, in my opinion. Can we move on to debt service? Okay, so I think there's consensus here without taking a formal vote. There's consensus of that. Let's go back. Let's go and have a conversation around debt service. If you could put the slides up, on the CAC, TMC, whatever the slide is. Actually, want to put the TMC slide on. That's us. There you go. So, my observation here, and it was not, I mean, I couldn't put my finger on it until Paul mentioned it. My observation here is that we have a pretty optimistic delivery schedule here. And I think we need to look at that. I'm not suggesting that this is a problem or it's bad. I just think that for our conversations, we should be, use the term, more realistic in terms of what we can deliver in the region. And that ought to be the base. The base is how can we deliver with absolute confidence? We can say with absolute confidence, we're going to be able to deliver all this stuff within the plan. I'm nervous about front loading things into a plan and then us running into labor shortage, material shortage, inflation costs, whatever those pieces are that could be a problem for us, that could come back and be a problem down the road. So my suggestion is, rather than looking at cash flow based on what we all submitted, it's we want all our project first, is to really look harder at what's a realistic delivery of the program first, and then look at financing around that, and then look at how can we move some of those up, and what is that cost associated with moving those dollars or those projects up, and then the commensurate dollars for that. That's a suggestion, because it's gnawing at me that we held that constant that we're going to get all this stuff done right at the beginning. And by the way, I think from a voter delivery standpoint, that's great. But I really do. I think the more we can deliver early, the better off we are, the region, et cetera. I'm in agreement. Just nervous about potentially over promising on that. That's good.
So I would say I actually agree with that.
You actually do?
But I feel, well, when we're talking about the economic projections, we have no control over that, where we as jurisdictions have more control over how and when we deliver projects. And this is one instance where I think it's probably better to use a pessimistic projection on how we can deliver, because I don't think that any of the voters would have an issue with we're over delivering, that we're delivering things sooner than we said. As opposed to, you said this was going to be done in the second phase of RTA next, and now it's not. So I think that's probably the safest bet, and then I think it also helps with that bonding projection as well if we're using that pessimism.
I also think it helps too on the what's called the commitment of the money, because we've had projects committed for years in the current RTA that keep getting pushed out. Well, but that also ties up potential other projects, and that's not fair distribution of the money across the board. You really need to be honest. If your project can go right now, it gets funded right now. If it can't go right now and it's going to roll around in design, or it's going to be designed by committee, and however that does, and it keeps pushing out, keep in mind that you're taking funding away from other projects that can go right away. And I think and that's why I'm against, maybe creating these quarters again of trying to pigeonhole projects. So give more flexibility with that. And it's incumbent upon all of the jurisdictions here at the table to be very realistic and not
let's say, artificially tight money.
Mr. Chair, I was just curious, Rick, can you tell me what the two big spikes in new expenditures in years 5 and 10 are? Those the two TIs?
Oh, good heavens.
Your chair, Mr. Credio, are you talking about the orange expenditure spikes there? So that would be, I think, largely repaying some principal on the debt. I'm not sure about year 10 in that case. That could be just some projects, but some of those will be going back to repaying the principal.
And to add to that, so there are first phase projects that are going to be continuing deep into period 2 as well. The Silver Bells, the 22nds, some of those big, ugly, complicated ones that are tens of millions of dollars, those stretch into there. And when you're bringing in the period 2 jobs, you're stacking those on top of it. So you start to get that cumulative amount as you ramp up with 3 projects out the gate, becomes 5 projects out the gate, becomes 7, then all overlapping at the same time. So what you see is that bell curve spike that happens in those middle years on top of what David's saying.
Yeah, I think that, ADOT obviously has a policy that anytime they take on a non-ADOT project, they want cash up front. So part of that is related to the 2 TI projects to actually put the cash in an account for ADOT even before they start anything.
You don't trust us? John?
Yes, honestly, I'm sorry about that. I do think, those are, those are kind of rules that we have in terms of what are required for funding. But other rules beyond that. So we can quantify those as this is a requirement for ADOT. And this will be a cost for financing relative to those 2 projects. What I'm vague on is what are the requirements for other financing options? When do we apply financing? When is it required? When will we use it? Is there some kind of discussion similar to what you talked about before with the contingency discussion, where we can lay down rules beyond what the requirements are for ADOT and things like that, where when the financing would be appropriate and when it would be used, so we can get clarification as to whether we're using 77 million or 100 million and where that scenario came from?
So, and I'll speak from, my opinion on that. And we've heard you talk about, it's got service before and that financing produced. There's really 2 fundamental reasons, in my view, for considering debt service. One is because we want the convenience, I'll say that, of constructing projects sooner than we would otherwise. I mean, it's convenience, right? Why you put your credit card on so you can have it today versus, waiting to save up for it. That's one. The other, though, which I think is important in the discussion of exploration, is the potential to hedge against inflation, right? I mean, that's just good business, right? If you are thinking like what happened in 08, 09, that prices are down, we need to take advantage, or interest rates are down, and the money is really cheap, then we should take advantage of that. That's just my opinion on how to consider this. And so I think when you break those 2 apart, the convenience, quite frankly, is up to us, right? I mean, that as representatives of the region, what do we think would be of value sooner rather than later, right, to move that up? The second part, we can't predict because we don't know, right? And that's where, in my opinion, the placeholder comes in. And that's really the piece that the policy decision will be what we do sooner, because it's better for the voter, better for the resident, better for the system. The second is a business decision, a business case based on what's going on interest rates, what's going on with potential inflation, what's going on up there. Now, both of those can be lumped into one, but my suggestion would be that at least we think about them a little differently, because that will affect the amount. Right? And then again, going back to the schedule, I think the schedule should almost show little if no financing for starters, with a placeholder for financing. And then quite frankly, if we as entities want to see some of our projects move up, we should be having a conversation about the value of that to us. What's the value to the city or the town or the county in moving their project up? And if the value is such that, hey, man, it makes sense, we might save some money, we'll pony up a little more ourselves because there's value to our particular entity or constituency group. Just a thought there. So that's sort of put into.
And I agree with that. I love, and thank you for putting in the fact that I think it's a discussion to have for each jurisdiction to have if they desire to move it up. I think that's an important component. And I like the idea that you talked about in terms of the math. If we see a significant economic issue where we can save 10% on potential construction costs and bond for less than 5%, you know, that's a no-brainer business decision. So thank you. That was really very good.
I just want to say that I actually agree with that. The one thing I wanted to add to that though, is I do think that it's not just a jurisdiction that has to evaluate the benefit, but I think the region has to evaluate the benefit because there are, you know, I mean, it is a regional transportation and it may be occurring within a jurisdiction, but it may have more far-reaching implications for the region. So I would say it's a little bit broader than actually just.
I would agree, Terry. I mean,
You actually agree though?
Let's but let's think about the interchange in Marana, right? That is counted towards Marana because it's in the city limits of Marana, the town limits of Marana. Right? But we all benefit. The fixing the improvement of that interchange is a value of the region. I've said that for quite a while. And I can see a scenario where we want that done sooner rather than later, right? And there's value. So I don't disagree at all. I think there's value there. But again, those are conversations to some level based on the project. Now the program as a whole, absolutely the placeholder there. Just a little nervous about putting too much there because then we're going to have an explanation more so than we would otherwise. Not to preclude us from having that, but I do, and quite frankly, if we run the numbers and it saves us money, saves us money to do it that way, to finance it, then we should be doing it, right? Then we won't need as much for that sort of thing. It's truly saving us cash.
And I want to make sure I clarify with Terry that I agree with that perception of Prudent Arrow, but in the broader sense with what.
Yeah, no, don't worry.
But it's got to be almost a project specific discussion sometimes.
Agreed. In that case, then I'll throw it to Mike. I actually go. Actually, you here. Water points are separated and distinct. The blending of the money and the overlap of the actual money associated with it, from my experience on that, isn't quite as precise. To say 20 million for this, 80 million for that, or 50 or whatever. I don't know that it gets that particularly laid out, but if it has the guidance around that, then I think that would cover to that issue.
I think to that point, Rick, again, going back to, if we have a placeholder, I don't know that has to be the only money that's looked at for debt financing. So in other words, let's say 37 million, that basically is for debt issuance and debt service to some of it, right?
Either of those two purposes, be it either convenience or.
Agreed.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, if in fact it saves us money, right? Then that means it should free up dollars within the program or the region to say, we want that interchange of those components included. So that what I'm suggesting, Rick, is those discussions can be on a project by project basis. We probably wouldn't bond for one project, but depends on next. But we could have that type of a discussion for a subcomponent of the overall program, and then look at all sources of potential revenue.
I'd like to make a comment, but Bill had his hand up. I don't know if that's from before or not.
Bill, are you still?
Might have been from before.
All right, let's.
So if you don't mind,
I don't mind.
just in terms of the analysis that goes into making that decision, very extensive process back in 2011, 2014. We went through a very extensive process to demonstrate that bonding was the right thing to do. So nobody's suggesting that we're going to do these automatically. When the time comes, you have good data, you take that data, you look at the interest rate, you look at the bonding payments, you look at what your future savings on the project might be, and then you make that decision at that time. And we did that both in 2011 and 2014. So that's yet to come, and obviously at the discretion of the board, they can make that decision. All we're saying is that looking at the cash flow alone and looking at the diagram you have, we have two options. One, to assume we're going to bond, and it's an assumption, or to push projects out, which that was discussed as well. Other than don't do those two things, what we have currently is not realistic for delivery.
Thank you, appreciate that. So what's your pleasure in terms of a placeholder for, I'll call it debt service or for bonding? We have, the TMC modified plan, I believe, had 37 million in it, which is on the left here. We understand what that means and what that looks like. Is there any appetite for going down the path of leaving it the way we had originally thought, with the expectation that it is a placeholder, and two, as far as outlined, the analysis that would occur when the program is ready to have that discussion? Thoughts on that?
If you don't mind, go to the 77 option as well, just so they can see the difference.
As I say, I'm more comfortable going with the balanced budget. Go with the 100 billion.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Especially if we're going to look at, under promising delivery, I'd be kind of curious to see if the 77 million covers. Gets us a lot closer to the finish line than what
Just from the graphic, assuming the schedule is the same, which is the given on these, the schedule's all the same. The 77 million obviously gives us less negative cash flow, which means we would have to defer less projects than 37 million. Other thoughts or comments? I would like to see less. I'd like to see 37 million as a placeholder, because I have confidence that we'll have a conversation about what that looks like going forward.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm just curious as to what the bond companies would look at. I mean, we're making a presumption that we're AA+. And if we go with a smaller reserve debt service, is that impacting how they evaluate it?
So I respond to that. We meet with them every time that we go through the rating process. And every time we met with them and had this conversation, it says that having that $100 million set aside as a reserve is part of their assessment when they look at the assessment on being bond worthy or debt worthy. If you have a set aside reserve policy and a dollar amount, that's a good sign to them.
So I would also suggest meeting with the rating agency, but our rating that reflects that. It's a function of how much you want. It's not a function of what you have. So depending on what you're actually asking the loan, how much of the loan, it's a function of what you're using individually. But yeah, the more you've got, the better. But if we go to a lesser amount, it means that we're going to be borrowing less. Then the rating agencies will look at the reserve in the context of that ask.
Mr. Chairman, what's our debt service expenditure to date on RTA 1?
Currently we had the 2011 bond and then the 2014, and we're projecting $75 million to finish those two.
75 million?
75 million.
70, and those would all be repaid during the life of RTA 1?
Correct. They don't go beyond the revenue projection, estimate. So they will be paid out. The 75 is the projection for the interest payment.
Let's go to Sam and then we go Sam.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think before I would weigh in on an amount, I'd really like to understand better how we could potentially cash flow the plan. I mean, I think the way that it was presented to us today is that we absolutely have to have $100 million of bonding capacity to complete the program. But yet the conversation has been, well, do we actually need that 100 million? What I'm hearing is, yes, we do, based on the way the projects are currently scheduled. So, I have a little bit of concern about setting aside 100 million for contingency, 100 million for debt service. That's $200 million in the plan. And just a quick reminder, when we presented our City of Tucson plan several months ago, there was $200 million set aside for pavement rehabilitation for the region. So that could buy us a lot of pavement fees, just potentially setting those to aside makes me nervous. So I'd like to see a balanced cash flow plan before I would agree on the dollar.
Sam, when you say balanced, are you talking a pay as you go?
Like, is that without putting this program without bonding?
I think, the comment earlier with regard to what we spent so far, keep in mind that's also with PAG sweeping helping. So we're trending, we're probably trending at over 100 million in the current.
No, I think it's even greater than that.
And just to add to Sam's question, we did run the model without any bonding. In reality, you're looking at 10 years beyond the life of the plan to be able to cash flow projects. So we're going to put a 20-year plan out there, but we won't be able to pay for it until all the cash comes in, and then you can pay it out after that. So pay as you go won't happen in 20 years. It's just not a realistic scenario. And we can run it, we can show you that, but you have to push projects 10 years out.
I would like to see that. I would disagree with that, by the way. I mean, obviously, when you're generating cash, you're not going to have money in the bank until the last year. But I can't believe it's 10 years.
Well, it's 10 years out because of capacity, which we had another question. How much is the capacity for expenditure? And we're saying, yes, you can have all the cash at the end of the 20 years. You can deliver them in 2 years. It takes 10 years to burn that money. Capacity of burning and delivering projects, it'll take 10 years to deliver those projects once you have the cash in the bank.
Now I'm disagreeing with you. I'm actually. But wait a minute, listen to what you just said.
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, we're going through that, we go through that every day. But the plan assumes the capacity is there in the first 10 years, right? I mean, and that's not just the additional capacity of bonding, but that's also all the everything else. So it's kind of like the baseline makes no sense to me that you cannot deliver within. And I'm not suggesting you could deliver within 20 years. That's unrealistic, right? But additional 10 years seems excessive in terms of delivery.
So let me rephrase it. So when you look at it, when you look at the expenditure side, we're making an assumption that there is a capacity for delivery, and that amount would be about $100 million a year. We don't, as a region, we don't have the capacity to burn more than $100 million a year. So if you wait until the revenue, the cash flow is built up, let's say you have $1 billion built up, it takes 10 years to burn that $1 billion. That's where that's coming from. So you pay as you go, you burn what you can until you have a build-up reserve, and that's why it takes so long to burn it. Now, if you can all burn $1 billion in 1 year, more power to you. We have 1 billion in the bank and you want to burn it in 1 year, yes, that's doable.
I'm gonna push back. I won't go there to the point, but I think what you're saying, makes sense, assuming that we wait for $1 billion to get into the bank and then we burn it.
Well, that's paid.
Well, not necessarily. It's pay as you go. So as revenue comes in, if it's 100 million a year, 150 million a year, that's what the expectation is. We start spending in the second or even third year, which means if you do the math, you're adding maybe 2, maybe 3 years to the program, not 10.
We'll show you the model again.
I'd like to
Again,
do
it's just a simple model.
we're assuming you're gonna spend so much in the first 20 years until the cash builds up, and then it's gonna take time to burn this one.
All I'm saying is, I don't think you can say the region doesn't have capacity when you're showing and demonstrating on this model that it does have capacity to burn significant dollars in those first few years. That's what it's Jen, and then we'll.
And Mr. Chairman, because of the cost of money and the flexibility in a placeholder, I think we need to have something in for debt service. I think 100 million is too high. I'm comfortable at the 37, being more comfortable at about 50, but I think we just got to have a number in there for just the reasons you stated. I look back now at when, you know, the money was about 1%, which we had done more at that time.
All of us.
So I would like to have the board have that flexibility.
There's an inflationary consideration too with regard to a bunch of the projects. Yeah, because what we're seeing right now is contractor availability. We're contractors in from the Phoenix area. So again, we want to do an even distribution as much as we can over the life of this program, because we end up cutting our own throats with our own inflation. I wanted to ask, because I agree with an earlier statement you made that by having everything front loaded, that's more appealing to voters. You get product on the streets quicker, and there's going to be a quicker return. Countering, Paul brings up, how would you explain that we're stretching it to reduce? How would you describe that as a benefit? If I can put you on the spot for that one.
City manager is on the spot all the time. So I think that, again, it's the conversation with the voter. It's a conversation with the voter. We explain to the voter, you vote here, and look what it looks like. And we don't get into the minutia of, oh, and if you like bonding, we'll do this, but it's going to cost more. And basically it does, right? It's the credit component of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we outlined in the schedule what the delivery looks like. And we hold to it and say, this is what we're delivering. Going back to the comments made earlier, it can be by quarter, it can be by year, it can be by 5. I mean, whatever the conversation can look like, it's got to be an elevator speech. It's got to be something that we can all band around to say, you vote for this, and here's what it's going to mean. And so when Paul's having a conversation, you know, with his residents, what does it mean to that 1 or 2 or 3 projects that are, whenever they are in the program, be able to say, when they're asked, that project is scheduled to be delivered here. And we want to deliver it there, and here's how we're going to do it. Okay. And by the way, that doesn't mean we can't deliver it sooner, and we might be able to, given some of the conversations. I don't think that that's a huge issue. I do think that it's important that we leave ourselves flexibility. That's true. I do believe that. Because I think that it's important for us to at least not paint ourselves in a corner. And if we can deliver it, it's cost of money and all things, we should do that. Pay off that credit card early.
No, thank you for that.
Other thoughts or comments? So I've heard,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm kind of seeing both sides of it. And I will say, you know, that for the town of Marana, our hope is to have Cortero at the very front of this thing. I think a lot of people in the region are hoping for the same thing. And I don't know that we would have the monies available to be able to fund that project if we're not able to bond for it. So that's my concern. I go back to Rick's presentation earlier, you know, an hour and a half ago, perhaps, about bonding capacity and AA ratings. And I do get concerned that if we're not showing that amount, that does affect it. I don't know what the effect is. I don't know, you know, what they would say if we had 37 or 50 or 77 or something else. I don't know. But I do think it's important that we demonstrate that we are setting that money aside. So I personally feel that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, and we've spent 100+, including monies that we've swept. So not to include monies that we swept. So I do have concerns, and I do think that 100 million is not an unreasonable number. I think it's a number that we can expect to utilize over the course of the 20 years?
I just want to respond to that. Maybe it was a question, maybe it wasn't, but.
It wasn't.
Our funds are highly in demand, very competitive. They actually compete for it, so we get better rates if we demonstrate that we're able to pay it back.
Which makes sense.
Other thoughts or comments? So my suggestion is, I think there's agreement on a placeholder. Out there. Agreement on placeholder that having something in the plan for debt service is reasonable and important. It provides the region flexibility, the board flexibility in the delivery of the program and the process. My nervousness is kind of back to what Sam mentioned earlier in terms of the magnitude. Because quite frankly, we're reacting to the magnitude based on a schedule that is, I'll use the term front loaded. And I think there's ways to have a conversation around smoothing that to reduce that, I'll use the term negative cash flow that's outlined on this graphic. And I don't think that the graphic is fair in that way because it does assume that those projects are front loaded. So I would again suggest a smaller amount. A smaller amount than the 100 million. I had suggested the 37. Right. You had suggested 100, right? You had suggested 100, Terry. Jan suggested 5 million. I didn't even actually agree with that. Let's try to move this. How about we split the difference a little bit, and what if we go to 50 million? What if we suggest 50 million is the placeholder for debt service going forward? It's more than we had originally had in the plan, not as much as what we had before. How do you feel about that?
I'd be comfortable if we could do that evening out of the projects, look at that cash flow and have some type of there is an ability to do this with that 50 million. I don't think it'd be comfortable with that.
I agree with Paul. I'd like to see some kind of a framework. We have to come to Terry's point. Because we're going to have to do financing of some of these things, and I think Forterro is a good example of that. So we need to see a framework of what has to be done, what may be done, and what would help us to be done. So, and the scheduling is a part of that. So I'd like to see something like that.
I was just going to remind everyone that at the board meeting, we had that discussion about phasing and scheduling, and obviously our response was we have what we received from individual entities. Of course, I want to take this opportunity, going back to Paul's comment, that by all means, if you can push projects out, please do let us know, and we can run various models. But we're not going to make an assumption on your behalf. You need to tell us which ones you're willing to push back. But
here's my gut on that. I have a sneaky suspicion that the best way to approach that would be for us as a group to really look hard, because I don't know that anyone would push back on saying Otero needs to be in the earlier part of the program, and have a conversation around that versus putting PAG or RTA staff in a place where we're saying me, and then all these projects are right out of the chute. Probably not fair to have that expectation that they would have to go through that. So I'm just suggesting that maybe there's a conversation that we should have here in the not too distant future where we look at that again. I know we looked at it in one time, and then truly try to figure out from a project delivery standpoint which ones make sense to put where in the program. That's just a thought. Yeah, and then.
I think we do have a lot of homework to do, but for, as you said a few moments ago, Michael, for purposes of discussion today and placeholder holders, I would with the 50 million. Putting that forward.
Thank you, Jim.
No, to your point, Mr. Chairman, I think if we get into this situation, there's gonna be a lot of jockeying going on as to, prioritization on the projects. So you're looking at this group maybe being a decision maker on prioritizing what really makes a lot of common sense to get these projects delivered.
Yeah. I'm absolutely for having this conversation amongst this body, but I think PAG as our metropolitan planning organization, that's part of, they're less centric on each individual jurisdiction and they're looking at the entire region. It would be, I'd like to see their opinion on this.
$5 I'll put you in front. So I would really need a recommendation if that's what you're asking.
I just want to talk about this is a spreading out of those projects and the planning of this, you know, what's the overall regional picture that's dictated by a jurisdiction?
In terms of delivery.
Yes.
So, Jerry, are you okay with 50 or you still pushing hard on 100?
I still feel that 100 is.
You want to take a formal vote on that then, so that we can at least, because I don't want to say consensus. We've got some votes that are not in there. It's not fair. So why don't we do that?
So, Mr. Chair, I heard, you know, the executive director say that 100 million was their recommendation, and previously it was based around what RTA 1 was. It was more, it was at the $77 million amount. And so the 100 million is because of this analysis that's shown here where the cash flow goes negative. Is that correct? There's a revision being made to what was previously recommended?
No, our recommendation was always $100 million. The CAC came back with 77. So we're comparing CAC's recommendation with TMC's recommendation and then going back to what would create a situation that you don't have a deficit.
Okay.
And 100 million, that's the number.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I think a point, Mr. Chair, you made earlier was that if we can minimize what the period of negative cash flow is, then we can have that as a starting point for trying to adjust the schedule on delivery of the project. So I'm hearing still a desire for 100 million. The 77 million is less of an impact than the 37 million on the negative cash flow aspects of it. It's not where it is on the 100 million side, but we also know that delivery needs to be revisited. And so I would maybe suggest that as a placeholder starting point with the idea that we come together, again, as you suggested, and have that conversation about the delivery schedule. I think to go back to the jurisdiction and say, what do you want to voluntarily move out? We may not see enough movement to get there. So I think 77 million as a placeholder with a commitment by this committee to then look at project scheduling to eliminate that negative cash flow. And if we can overshoot and get to a better position, then maybe we can walk back off of that 77. Just my suggestion.
Just a clarification on the motion, or if the motion comes up.
There's none on the floor.
But when that,
I'll entertain it.
if and when a motion comes up, if there can be some clarification that this is purely a placeholder based upon the reevaluation of the project timing, that might be more palatable because, I mean, as it stands right now, I'm for the 100 million. But if we can make the math work, make the model work for something less than, I'm supportive of that too, but just not on a vote that's just an absolute, just a placeholder without some type of caveat to it.
Got it. I think the intent here is to put a placeholder, for lack of a better term, into the conversation so that we can move on and come back and revisit that at a future time. But we probably need to give some direction on the amount. So then when we do have conversation about potential excess revenue, that's already say decided as a cap, and we can have conversation going forward. I still maintain that 50 would be reasonable as a placeholder with everything that Carmine and Paul said in terms of revisiting it down the road. I think it's fine, and I don't have any problems about that. But I do think that it will require a review of the cash flow, which is project schedule probably further before we get farther down the path. I'm just nervous about having that much money set aside. So that's all. There you go.
So if it's just, yes, so thank you, Mr. Chair. So if it's just a placeholder, why does it matter whether it's 50 million or 100?
In my opinion, because I think as we're talking through potential excess revenue, that will be important. In my opinion. I think that'll be important. You guys feel comfortable?
Who's gonna offer a motion?
I would entertain a motion. I think you know where most folks are, but I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Wilson, I would move that we recommend an inclusion of a minimum of $50 million in debt service.
Second.
Second by John, thank you.
Is there further discussion on that? Point of clarification, placeholder, you did say, right? Placeholder, which I think gives opportunity for us to have more conversation going forward. And who knows, if we're rolling and go, want to finance more, you know, we should have that. Further discussion on that. So the motion is for a $50 million placeholder. Further discussion on that. Hearing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Who was the no?
Paul and Terry?
Terry.
Paul, Terry.
Terry voted.
Paul, Terry. I thought I heard wrong.
Was there anybody else other than Paul and Terry that voted against this motion? Just for the minutes? Okay,
So Paul and Terry, the only two opposed.
Right.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to, do we need a break? Do we need a break? 5 minutes. 5 minute break. All right, clock's ticking. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
6 minutes, but we'll be okay if we can have everybody come back at some point. No, hear from my job. And to, if I had a gavel, I'd have lay on it.
Would have been a lot louder in my head.
So, looks like we have, I think just second or so. So I'd like to just go on, we start the next topic. So I really appreciate the conversations. I think these have been really valuable and opportunity, and we can see those opportunities. Of course, it's always easy when we have more money than we think we do. But really, I do think it shows the spirit of cooperation. And I think that value when we have as we evolve possibly in the point. Okay, the third thing that I thought would be worthy of discussion based on the RTA board conversation was the use of, we'll just call it the HERF money. There was 75 million in the TMC model, and Carmine or Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. My recollection of that was a proposal to use 75 million, which equates to 5 million a year, starting in year 6, going through year 20, which equates to somewhere around 11% of the allocation of those years. Is that correct? Is that what I remember?
That is correct.
Okay. Because I think there was the impression that it was taking all of the first values, putting them into the RTA plan, which is not the case. That's not accurate. But that was the proposal that was made. It was part of the TMC modified plan. Jan aptly reminded us that the RTA board would talk about it. So I know that there was some conversation about concern regarding that going forward, and I thought we should probably talk about that as a group and think through what that looked like, one way or the other. So, Carmine or Jan, is that pretty accurate? Go ahead. Is that pretty accurate overall? Sorry, Carmine.
That's okay.
Light of an empanada
Just
there.
finishing my empanada, absolutely, it was delicious. Just to point out that it wasn't limited to HERF, it was HERF and it was STPG, SDBGT funds also, so it's the two sources of funds, and it was about just under 12% of the allocation to the region.
Thanks. I just referred to HERF, but good clarification, it's regional allocated dollars. Jerry, you had a comment?
No.
Sorry. Anybody? All right, I'm good with it, so I'll just move forward. So here's a thought on that, and remember, at least when we started this conversation years ago now, we are constrained by the dollars in the plan, and quite frankly, the needs far outweigh, for all of us, far outweigh the dollars that are coming in from a potential sales tax. And I think we established that, and that's why we went through all the brain damage to get to this point, right? But ultimately, those dollars are constrained, and so we need to look at other sources of revenue. The reason that I was supportive of that is because I do think that it is a good use of regional money to address some of the needs that we have as a region. I believe that, and so it isn't just separating RTA from regional money, because I think it's one and the same in terms of solving regional challenges and regional constraints. If it were a higher number, a higher percentage of the regional allocation, I would say, hey, you know what, we really need to think about that, because we don't want to paint ourselves in the corner with regard to the flexibility for those dollars going forward.
But I really and truly believe that that regional allocation can show the region, the funding partners and so forth, that we've been putting dollars towards it, which is, as Carmine just outlined, a little less than 12% for those years. And so that's why I quite frankly thought it was a good idea. But I'm open to a conversation around how that can work.
I guess my question is, if we have projects that would be eligible for those funds, why wouldn't we just take them out of RTA and use the funds as we would have normally used the funds for those projects rather than tying them to the RTA?
I think that's a great thought. Unfortunately, I didn't hear any willingness to take anything out of the plan for that purpose. And so you get to the same place, right? Which I'm totally fine with. But I didn't hear any willingness by the partners to do that and say, hey, I'll take this project out in favor of funding it another way. If there is a commitment to do that by folks, then we in essence get to the same place, because you reduce expenses and you reduce the revenue stream, which basically offset it. But Sam and then Paul.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. To piggyback on Beth's comment, I think the other side of that coin is demonstrating to the voters what we're going to do, what we're going to complete in the plan. And so when you take those projects out, you're right, we get to the same place, but it doesn't tell the same story to the voter. So the way I view the 75 million is that we as a region have some skin in the game. That not only are we putting our projects out there, but we're also putting some of our regional funds up as well to ensure the completion of this program. So again, it's just the other side of that coin. But I don't think we can forget that there's some narrative around what it is we're asking the voters to approve.
Good point. Liz?
Yes, I think this complements the conversation around the debt service. By going as high as we were thinking that we're going to need 100 million, if we can bring in additional dollars from other sources, it will help us to not have to carry out.
Good, thanks. Paul?
I'm not opposed to using regional PERF to help the RTA, but I think based upon very strict guidelines. One is that as projects come in, there's scope creep all the time on projects, and that's the job of the jurisdictions to keep the projects confined and constrained within the program. And that if a project doesn't need that for funding, for whatever reason, the funding should be made available through the PAG process, which is a competitive process that's monitored by the board. And it's not a sweep. I'm very much opposed to a sweep as more of a case-by-case basis for projects as they need it. Now I know we're talking about a plan with already set expenditures and revenues, and the expenditures outweigh revenues. Are we telling the public that we've underfunded something and we need to get money from someplace else? That would be my concern.
I think those are great points. I would say it a little differently. We have needs that outweigh the revenue that we're expecting from sales tax. And so we are demonstrating how we're going to address those needs. So yeah, we're underfunding, but I would say it the other way. I'd say that the needs are this big and the sales tax brings in this much money. So we're demonstrating how to address that need. And we tell the public, we tell the voter, here's how we plan to fund that going forward. And so I don't disagree. I just would be interested in that person.
Other thoughts or comments, Terry?
Well, I would tend to agree with Paul on this. I think I like his approach. I'm not sure how taking his approach really negatively impacts the RTA monies. And I get from the standpoint, the monies aren't specifically identified, but I think we still get to the same place.
I may add to that. Obviously, this was discussed extensively at the board level, and I had follow-up questions from some of the board members, and And in that context, the question was, well, what's the difference between RMAP and RTA? And the response, and most of you have been involved, the response is that, you know, RMAP is fiscally constrained. RMAP has all the funds within the region and what's available to the regional council to do exactly as what Paul described. So they have that discretion through the RMAP process. RTA is very specific for a dedicated funding source, and keeping RMAP separate was really, I think, the direction that at least some of the folks that had concerns was, well, let's use RMAP for that purpose. Just want to make sure you all kind of put that in perspective as well. So we're already using the RMAP to demonstrate the need, demonstrate what's available, what funding sources can be used to meet the needs, and that's financially constrained. And that's the story that we need to tell the public that, yes, the needs are great. This is how much money is available, and the regional council has authority to use those funds for anything that's in the RMAP.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, go ahead, Carmen.
So one of the other things to point out is that those funds were applied only to active transportation and safety projects. And throughout the discussion of putting together the project list, we've recognized that there is not adequate geographic coverage on the projects that were selected. And we had, a number of groups come in front of various of these bodies, CAC, TMC, the RTA board representing Green Valley interests, saying that, they didn't see themselves in this plan. And there were projects identified by the county that were inserted into that safety and active transportation category that we thought responded to that request to have improvements in that area. So I just make that point as well, that at least on two projects, Camino de la Canoa and then White House Canyon Road, those were a result of a realization that there is currently nothing in the plan in the Green Valley area.
Carmen, other thoughts or comments? Here's my gut. It seems like the conversation. But again, it's how you look at it. We have more needs than we have money. So this is a source of money we've identified. From that perspective, the conversation can then be, backtrack. At this point, do we reduce some projects and identify that as the source? Recognizing Sam's concern about if we reduce the potential, and Carmen's, but frankly, if we reduce sprinkling the distribution of the project, does that negatively impact us or affect us as a region? That's the other piece of it. Maybe there's some language that, depending on how revenues come in, we can have a conversation about the need for that going forward. Maybe that's an opportunity for us, right? Kind of like, sort of like what we're doing with the rest of this, right? If there's revenues that come in above a certain amount and after we use certain projects, I don't know, pick the language, but then maybe we say those dollars are no longer needed for the delivery of this program, and that will be allocated for other regional priorities. I don't know. It's kind of throwing that out as that's a hard one, because you almost have to include it as a placeholder. We use placeholder a lot. Include as a placeholder, but recognizing that we may not need it. And then what do we do? What do we tell the public? If they're looking at the ballot, what do we tell them we're going to do? That's what we do.
I think that goes back a little bit to what I was originally proposing, but it's almost like we're having two concurrent conversations here. We're having a conversation saying that what do we do with excess revenues and how do we talk about that? But then we're still trying to shove all the projects into that same original $2.34 million bag. So I think we have to kind of decide which route we're going to go. That if we are going to say, let's talk about those excess revenues, and we don't have a problem saying that, look, this is a snapshot in time and it's a pessimistic snapshot, And if there are excess revenues, these additional projects would be included. Because then we do still have that option that as we move forward, if the TMC and the board all recommend, hey, there's additional projects that we really need to do, they can still sweep those monies and they're not limited to that 5 million per year. That if there's something that as a region we really need, we can add that in, but we're not pre-sweeping the funds.
So I like that, and I think it actually goes to what you presented earlier. And this whole recommendation or alternative plan, I didn't think I'd want everyone to hear an additional plan, but with this new modified plan, I think it does just that, right? I mean, it allows for the flexibility based on how the money comes in over time. And then we're not putting ourselves in a position up front where we're sweeping the money and we're coming and asking for the money if we need it, when we need it for a specific project, to Paul's point. So the more I think about it, the more I really like what's in the light blue.
Translate that in terms of take out the stuff that you suggested, take out the 75 million as a revenue stream, replacing it, or set a cap or a minimum when as revenues come in that goes out. That's taken off. You're not suggesting revised plan. No, I'm not opposed. I'm just asking for clarification.
I'm not suggesting we revise the plan. I'm suggesting that we utilize a floating, I guess, if you will, amount based on what comes in, and that we not tie ourselves into 75 million sweep of the monies right from the very beginning.
Maybe we shouldn't use the word sweep. I mean, it's usually one up here. And Tom, you got a comment? Thank you for serving us here.
Yeah, it seems like an argument that I heard kind of at the end of a CAC meeting might be helpful to share at this point, and that was about kind of disclosing projects that we would do or will build if we get extra money. The problem with that has always been that it's kind of counter to the annual budgeting process that the board always goes through, where if there's money left, they'll assign it perhaps to an individual project. The reality is you don't know if you're going to exceed your 2.34 billion until year 19 or 20, because at any time you could have a reduction in the amount of revenues that are collected. And that was kind of one reason that the CAC recommended that we do a formal 10-year review and essentially expect that if there were significant changes, we'd go back to the voters for it. But I'm just concerned that you're essentially going to be promising projects, because if you put that on a ballot that we'll build this if we get the money, I think it just sets up some really bad optics and conversations that would be hard to have with the public. 20 years from now, it might not even be a project that you want to do. So anyway, that was kind of the conversation that we'd had at the CAC, and as a result, really tried to stick to a fiscally constrained, list of projects. And I think we're still doing that. And, Beth's idea seems to do that as well. If you're using the money that everyone's anticipating will be found money, if you will, next month when the updated projections come in.
Maybe a way of saying that, maybe a little differently, just running on my head, is the $100 million contingency, 75 million of that is from the region. Another way to think about it. And so we say then, if we don't need that, if we overshot that, we don't use the regional money. And if we undershot it, then we use more regional money down the road. That's another way to view this, as opposed to the 75 million is for the plan for projects. We utilize that in our hip pocket as the contingency or part of the contingency going forward. It's another way to think about it, because that message could be a powerful one to say, and here's our fallback.
I was just gonna.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Just to confirm, Beth, that new proposal does pull the 75 million out, or it keeps it in?
It pulls it out, but Tom, to your point, that's why I had also suggested that they're not named on the ballot, but during the discussions with the public, to the point that everybody's making that about regionality and making sure we have coverage, that they can be used as examples of projects. And the accountability is that those projects live in the administrative code, so that that list lives somewhere, so that we can't all conveniently forget what was on it, but it's not a ballot project. And that gives us that flexibility that if it's something we're anticipating we're gonna need in 15 years, and 15 years from now, we don't need that project, that's the discussion that can be had, and it doesn't have to go through that formal process that we're seeing with these projects, where the scope has changed over time based on what the actual needs are.
Yeah, I get it, and I think that's a good kind of Band-Aid on that potential situation, and helps to not be so confusing perhaps to voters. But I still have that concern that you don't really know where the program's going to be very early in this process. In fact, very late in the process, in the 20-year program, do you really know where you sit?
So I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to leave. So I've got an appointment I need to go to. Let's folks waiting. Just what I would suggest is this topic needs to be finished up, whatever that looks like going forward. Please don't look so happy that I'm leaving. I apologize.
Do a pulse check. I have 13 or 12.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't we do a quick pulse check?
I gotta be out of here at 11:30. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I'm sorry, I'm already late, but why don't we do a quick pulse check? Paul, I know you have your hand up. We're just digging with this list here. Where are you with leaving the 70? I'll just paraphrase it, leaving the 75 million in the plan with the conversation that it is based on the contingency, loose language, contingency / excess revenue. I don't know what that exactly looks like, but I'm just suggesting that out loud. Where are you with that? Is there anybody jumping up and down about that, or?
I'll offer.
Okay.
Then I was gonna comment on, maybe we hold this conversation until we get the new revenue projections in. But what you've suggested is palatable.
Other thoughts? Anybody disagree with that?
So, yeah, I'm trying to think of a reason why it doesn't make sense.
I feel like I'm in a council meeting.
But I'm really not coming up with one, so I think I would be okay with it.
Well, look, here's the thing, right? The reality is we're all trying to deliver the code. So we know we have more needs than we have revenue. And so we've thrown ideas, all of us have thrown ideas on how to get to that utopian point. And so and I think somebody mentioned, Tom, actually, we don't know what's going to happen 19 years from now, or 20 years from now, but we're doing the best we can. And I think as long as we are upfront with what our thinking is, and we leave and memorialize first that someone can pick up and say, okay, they did anticipate and convey the voter. I think we're solid. And so I would throw that out. So there's a litmus test. I think we're okay leaving the 75 million with those conditions, let's say, which is contingency and excess revenue. We can have that. Paul's thought that maybe we continue this conversation as soon as we get the revenue projections, the new revenue projections.
When is that due, by the way? We're hoping we'll have it at the March and then in time for the RTA board meeting in April.
When is that scheduled?
The board meeting, I believe it's April 4th.
So, the 4th is a Thursday, I think.
Yes.
So maybe we reconvene
On the third.
well, or I think the second's bad, because I think there's a board meeting, there might be a council meeting. How about Monday, the 1st?
There's a board suit.
On the second, right? How about we reconvene, assuming we can get those numbers, we reconvene on the 1st, and we'll, blow some time doing that. I think there could be value, and then we can do two things. One, finish the conversation to some level about where the revenue and what that looks like, but also at that time have enough time to digest Beth's proposal, and then we can come back. Beth, go ahead.
I would ask for one more thing from PAG for that meeting, is we talked about that, the projection for the delivery. Knowing what the individual jurisdictions submitted as their priority, I'd kind of like PAG to come back rather than us shooting in the dark and saying, hey, I'll move this to period 2, I'll move this to period 3. That they come back and tell us what a 50-year constrained or about $50 million constrained project, what that timeline looks like and how people's projects would shift. And then at that point, we could talk about the horse trading as to, do we really need to make it 77? Do we take it back down to 37? That they tell us what it looks like, and then we can object and figure out what we need based on our objections.
So for the next meeting, I hear 3 things, right? The revenue piece, which is, what does that mean to the plan? How does that potentially change the chemistry of that? 2, reaction to, I'll call it best proposal that was distributed today. And then 3 is the schedule. We'll call it the schedule for delivery of the program. And then we begin on that with a recommendation from the RTA staff or PAG, whatever have you want to bring us a recommendation that we can dissect and have a conversation. And I would even go a step further, assuming that the $50 million debt service is built in, which gives us opportunity then to react to it from a cash flow standpoint. What does $50 million debt service look like in terms of the schedule from what we showed today? Does that make sense to everybody? I'm sorry, but I got to run.
Don't forget your board.
Yeah, we can.
I did, and you, thank you. All right.
I'm actually sad that you're leaving.
Well, that hurt me.
Reflection on the vice chair.
I'll just pick up all the equipment and bring it back to the city.
If I may respond to Beth's comment there, so obviously we can do that, we'd be happy to do that. At the same time, I would request if anybody is able to submit their recommendations to us on what they're willing to push back, so please do that by email. So at least we can come up with something that's closer to what everybody would be comfortable with.
Anything else for today? Or is that help with the direction?
No, thank you. This was productive. I appreciate it. So again, another caveat, if we don't have the revenue estimates by April 1, I assume we don't want to meet. And so I want to put that caveat on the table as well.
Yes, correct.
I don't want to meet if we don't have the information. Everybody agrees.
Correct.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So if we don't have it, we'll let you know by email and we'll schedule it for a later date.
Okay. I just want to be sure. Is there anyone online I'm missing? Bill or Tom or anybody? If anybody got a hand up and I'm not seeing it as we wrap up. Doesn't look that way. Thank you.
I'm good.
Thank you. Anything else for this, for the good of the order? Thank you all.
Thank you.
My